anyone, anywhere who is affected by the virus is certainly a cause of concern for everyone, everywhere. And with that basic understanding, it doesn't matter whether you're from the north or south, white or black. Uh, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, if you're regular or irregular. If you are a human being, the chances are that you may be affected by this virus if you're exposed to it. That also means that there is a reason for us to look at this conversation in the context of irregular migration as well, which has also come to the fore now. A few countries in the Gulf also announcing amnesties. We see a lot of return migrant workers, return of migrant workers and their reintegration. What does this mean? India, for instance, has now embarked on a journey of perhaps the largest evacuation that the world has ever seen of its migrant workers back to the country through a mission called the Vande Bharat mission. This is in the case of India. We hear similar perspectives from Sri Lanka, from Nepal, who are also planning on evacuating their migrant workers in phased and procedural manners. So we will see that happening. And when they come back, they're coming back to their countries where they already we see job losses. In cases of countries in South Asia, massive job losses, and we will see these people now adding to the pressures. So what kind of reintegration policies do we have in mind as we go forward? We are also in a situation where we have to see a lot of government ministries now coming together. We're seeing that. So therefore, a whole of government approach is primarily of importance here. The whole of society approach, all of us, whether it's academics. I'm reminded of the Global Compact for Migration, adopted in 2018 December, paragraph 41 of that particular paragraph 44, excuse me, of the Global Compact for Migration talks about how the Global Compact can be implemented only if it has come through a whole of society approach. And that whole of society approach comprises of a whole range of stakeholders, including trade unions, employers, civil society organizations, migrant workers groups, and may I say, perhaps right at that top of that conversation, the evidence builders, the academicians, the researchers who we are really going to be engaging with today. So on that note, let me take it off and give you a bit about the panelists today. I won't go into detailed introductions because really all of them, each one of the panelists present here today are well known in their respective countries, and each one South Asia experts of their own merit. We have in alphabetical order, and I go by country alphabetical order from South Asia first. We have Mr. Dr. Ahsan Ullah from the University of Brunei, who will be speaking to us about the Bangladeshi context. Followed by him will be Professor Irudaya Rajan, who again needs no introduction, from the Center for Development Studies in India, and a well-renowned scholar on migration in South Asia and in the corridor to the Middle East. We also have, followed by Professor Rajan, will be Dr. Ganesh Gurung from the Nepal Institute of Development Studies in Nepal. Dr. Gurung, welcome. It's such a pleasure to see you after a while now. After Dr. Gurung will be Professor Nasra Shah from the Lahore School of Economics. I've known Nasra for a long time now. Nasra, it's such a pleasure having you here and to see you transition back into the Pakistani context from your previous avatar working in Kuwait. Nasra will be followed by Dr. Bilesha Veeraratne from the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka, another really big expert from the Sri Lankan context who I'm really looking forward to listening to, given the fact that Sri Lanka has seen perhaps the biggest feminization of migration. So we'll see that whole angle come out through Bilesha's perspectives as well. Once we've heard from these 5 speakers, I will take in a few question and answer. There are quite a few eminent personalities who've joined here. I recognize the presence of Dr. Binod Kadria, who is an institution by himself. So Dr. Kadria, such a pleasure seeing you. I also will then, once we have a few of these eminent personalities take the floor, we will then revert to an out of South Asia perspective. And that will be from Froilan Froilan Mallet Jr., who is with the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, but from the Philippines. And Froilan will give you a Filipino perspective. Froilan has also worked with the Abu Dhabi dialogue, and therefore will also make that link with the Abu Dhabi dialogue. And finally, Dr. Andrew Gardner from the University of Puget Sound in USA. And Andrew is an anthropologist and perhaps somebody who's really done a lot of research on the Middle East, the Gulf, and its rich human resource perspective. So Andrew, we look forward to hearing from you as well. We will follow that up with another round of quick reflections exchanged through the questions that come up in the chat box. We're really looking forward to an engaging conversation. So may I, without further ado, give the floor first to Dr. Ehsan Ullah from the University of Brunei Darussalam. Dr. Ehsan, you have about 8 minutes. In the 7th minute, I will come in to say that it's time for you to wind up. So with that, Dr. Ehsan, you have the floor.
Thank you. That's brutal, actually. Thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you, Global Research on Diaspora and Transnationalism so long, and for organizing such a talk. And it's really important. And I guess there could not be any better topic than this at this moment. When the entire world is crumbled into a nightmare. And since only you said 8 minutes, right? Okay. And in the morning, you told me that I had to emphasize on Bangladesh more rather than the Gulf states. But obviously, I have to give a bit of a brief on in order to set the setting. Like, for example, for Bangladesh, this is actually important. It's important in the sense that Bangladesh has been and actually is going to be one of the hardest hit countries in the world. Primarily because Bangladesh receives around $15 billion, which actually constitute around 9 to 10% of the GDP of the country. And this remittance come from around 9 million migrants from the world, and out of this, around half of them actually are from the Gulf states, and like around 4 million. That's roughly, because we don't have the exact number, and the BM80 that has all the numbers actually is questionable. Now, situation is like we know all that in the Gulf now around 200,000 cases and around 1,000 dead and all these things, and the problem is the migrants, those who are affected, and the majority of that are claimed to be affected in the Gulf, and this has fueled actually racist discourse at this moment across the region, and they're blamed for spreading this in the Gulf. But what happens primarily because we found actually, like from different reports, that around 2,000 informal labor accommodations in the GCC that are actually not fit for living, and they have been living in those accommodations, and extremely tightly packed, crammed, and at least 4 persons or the workers living in one room. And we know this means in unsanitary conditions, some without any access to running water, and their proximity to one another actually doesn't allow for social distances, which is the primary framework given by WHO, that we really have to maintain this in order to thwart the spread of this virus. And what is happening in Bangladesh? And the affected today is around 39,000 and died like 550. And I understand this is, in fact, we don't know actually if this is underreported or overreported. But I'm coming to that point. But and the test has been done that is performed on around 260,000. And you understand that it's actually extremely low as compared to the number of population, like 160 million populations that's only done on the 260,000 is really unthinkable. And this has happened primarily because until mid-March, the government has not paid any heed to what is happening around the world. Primarily, government has been busy with something else, and some statements came from the policymakers. Like one of our ministers said that it's a virus. This virus is nothing but some kind of sneezing, some kind of cough, so we don't have to worry about it. And some ministers said that we are stronger than the virus, we don't have to worry. That has sent a signal to the citizens that you can just go around, you can just hang around. So it has been taken so lightly. So this has become now so, so grave is the situation now. And the thousands now, and what happens again, until mid-March, those who arrived from the Gulf or somewhere else, and they were just kind of kept confined in one building close to the airport for a few days, and they started agitating and they were set free, and they just left the capital city by train, by buses, by launches, or whatever, however they made it, they did it. That means the damage actually has been done, and they left the capital city in the crowded trains, in the crowded launches, in the crowded buses. And once they arrived, and they have been just kind of kept confined. It doesn't work. So this happened, and there has been a lot of coordination flaws. Number one is sometimes in March, with the permission of the garments factories that are located in capital city have been opened. And what happened then, all the millions of garments workers who left Dhaka city for their rural areas, they started to come back to keep their job. What happens? They actually bumped into each other, into the garments workers and those who came from overseas, and they bumped into each other and they kind of blended with thousands and millions of people, and the damage actually has been done. And now what is happening? You see just every day. Actually, unofficially, we know that it could be millions those who are affected, and we don't know how many actually are dying. And we see some people are on the street and here and there, and the dead bodies have been recovered. So these are the things that are happening actually, and so we don't know the gravity of the problem at this moment. And the impact-wise, like we know, is globally. Obviously, you all know that this year is going to experience like 20 to 30% decline of the remittances. And so will be the case for Bangladesh as well. And we can't, as a Bangladeshis, we can't actually afford this loss. And primarily, because we understand that around 200,000 Bangladeshis are at the risk of losing job from the Gulf, let alone the other country, living in other countries. So what happens? Because almost half of the remittances that we receive coming from the Gulf. So, and almost, how to say, so I don't have the statistics, but almost 200,000, 100,000 almost are waiting to return to Bangladesh. And those who have returned, I said, and we don't have any idea how many actually carried the virus. We don't have any idea. And what happens once they return, and about we know now, this is one of these think tank that they did a study a couple of days ago, a couple of weeks ago. Those who returned, that almost 78% will have no work. But because they have left like maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, so that they can't integrate or to get the job back as they left the job and they left the country. And more than 50% will have no sufficient livelihoods. And 80% will have don't have at this moment any health protection. So these are the things that are happening. So I guess I stop here, and I can come back once there are some questions on that. Thank you. I hope I have not crossed the time limit.
You have been perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ehsan. I think you've really touched on some very important points in terms of return. And what we can see is, Bangladesh last year in 2019 received over $18 billion in remittances. I mean, that's a big figure. It is close to 6% of the national GDP as far as Bangladesh is concerned. But Bangladesh, we also know, has had some of the highest costs of recruitment. It has been perhaps one of those areas which really $4,000 to $5,000 per migrant worker going from Bangladesh. So it's also been seen a huge impact in terms of vulnerabilities of migrant workers as they leave the country. Very important, keeping in mind that Bangladesh has a separate ministry to look after the expatriates issues. That's the Ministry of Expatriates Welfare and Overseas Employment. And I know working very closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in terms of the overall coordination in Bangladesh. You mentioned about the returnees and how they are placed. One of the things that I would always keep in mind as I come back from any country is in terms of how I'm met at the airport, how I'm received at the airport. If I'm received at the airport with a smile on their faces, the people who receive me at the airport, I think that itself is the beginning, the first step in terms of a tick mark for good, effective reintegration. Anyways, with that, and I'm sure somebody who will have a lot to say, particularly Professor Irudaya Rajan from the Center for Development Studies, a prominent expert and a scholar at this, who has been writing a lot with regards to his most recent article being on the international migration governance, where he has written about the Global Compact for Migration in the Delhi Post. So quite a few elements coming from there. Professor Rajan, specifically on India, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Sabari, and thank you, the organizer, for inviting me to be part of this panel. Now, let me start with the first that the number we are talking from India to Gulf itself is wrong. We are talking about 9 million. I think it's wrong because the survey we have done in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which indicates Kerala and Tamil Nadu itself has 35 lakhs, 3.5 million. That means 2 states have 35 to 40 million, 40 lakhs. And the remaining in all the 35 states, but the flights are flying to every part of India from Gulf. So I think we have a lot of underestimation. I would put at the time, at least we have 10 million or 100 lakhs Indians in the Gulf. I think this is the first point I want to make, because we are talking with a less number, that itself indicate we are not interested in them. Once you don't have the number, that itself indicate you don't want them. The second point which I want to make is that migrants' problems are not known to us, because I am looking at migration for almost the Gulf for at least 20 years. I've been to Gulf in 2002. I went to the worker camps, I went to the embassy, everywhere I was talking. So whatever problem we are talking today is known to us, but only we never recognized. Thanks to COVID, COVID brought the migrants to the forefront. Otherwise, these problems were not there. Overcrowding, salary not paid, return migration, recruitment costs, this is all known to us. I don't think it's something new to us. Only COVID brought them when they were invisible. Now they are visible, not only international, also internal migration. So everybody is visible, partly because COVID brought them to the limelight. I think that is something we have to be grateful to the COVID, because COVID is really putting migrants in the forefront. Migrants and migration is being talked about. We never talk about migrants and migration, we only talk about remittances. I think COVID has changed the people. I think this is something very important point I want to make. The second point I want to make is this. What will happen? I think we know what will happen. I don't think we can predict many things, but I would like to say that return migration we are talking, my estimate is 10 to 15% of the Gulf migrants to India will come back. So I am putting at least 15 lakh Indians will come back. I'm not talking on Kerala here because I talked to Kerala government. 15 lakhs people means Kerala is going to get 3 lakhs. So we are going to get 15 lakhs throughout the country. But please remember, except the Kerala Chief Minister, India is, it's a state, not just India. India can do nothing. I have seen it. Even the Prime Minister announced 20 lakh crore package, not even mentioned single word on international migration, return migration. All the political parties go and collect money for their elections. They just not even mentioning their name, either the finance minister of India or the prime minister. So we know they are not in anywhere. I think nowhere they are there. I think they have been neglected, and this is the reality. So now, when you talk about the return, you talk about the people who are coming through the special flights. The special flights which are coming is only the trial for the movie. You are only seeing the teaser now. Movie you have to wait. Only teaser we are seeing. There are few flights coming from there. The movie will be only completed by September, December. That means the return migration will continue until September to December. So we will get the final return probably by December, and we will get 15 lakhs. Kerala is ready to receive at least 3 lakhs. Of course, the Kerala government tells me we will get 5 lakhs, but I am confident we will get 3 lakhs. So total India, we are going to get 15 lakhs. Now, please remember, the return migration is not something new. It's a old story. If you go to Gulf, they will not even allow to keep your dead body there. They'll send you back to India. They'll send you back to Sri Lanka. Dead bodies even not allowed to be buried. So they don't get green card, they don't get white card, they only get labor card and come back. So that's the reality. If they have to have given citizenship long time back, most of the Indians will be in the Gulf now. They will be holding the Gulf passports. Now, so the return migration is a part of the thing, and we have no data on return migration except for states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. We have a survey. Now, Kerala itself posting currently 15 lakhs return migrants. And we have 6 MLAs in the assembly. I was talking with them every day what to do for them. We have 16 MLAs in the assembly, 6 MLAs out of 135 MLAs in Kerala. Please remember, one MLA told me, we all won the elections, but the actually contested people for the election will be much more. Because they are the people who could come to the assembly. So please remember, return migration is a part of the Gulf migration. They have to go and come. It's like a migration cycle. Pre-departure, departure, live there and come back. Even the immigration bill, not even a single word about return migration. What are we talking in 2020 in the immigration bill? Not even a single word talked about return migration. You have to go, you have to come back. They are not going to die there. They are not going to get the green card. They are not going to get PR. They have to come back. We should have a strong policy for return migration. I think COVID is bringing that. I think that's something very important. But then you cannot put all return migration in one pocket. We have to divide them into 3 categories. What I call them in Kerala policy advice, at least 30% of them who are normal return. Is it COVID, or is it global crisis, or is it Gulf War? Is it Nidakat? There are people always return. There is a return. It's not like, because I talked to some people in Kerala many times. I have seen parents, grandparent was in the Gulf, parent was in the Gulf. I'm seeing now children in the Gulf. There are 3 generations of Gulf migrants. So, and they go to 5 countries. I talked to many people. They said, I was in the Gulf for 15 years. Where were you? 3 years in Dubai, 3 years in Qatar, 2 years in, Bahrain. So return is normal. So 30% will come, but they come with some money, some saving. They are not going to beg the government, but they need some policy advice where to invest. So government should talk about them to provide them opportunities for investment. The second group of people, what I call them, is remigration. All return is not going to stay in India, not in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. Remigration, we should talk about that. What is India is doing with Skill India project? We are spending crores of money on Skill India. What are we doing with them? We have to give them extra skills so that they can go back. 30% of them will go back. I have studied the remigration in the global crisis, Nidakat, even the Gulf War. People come, they spend 6 months, they will say, oh my God, I can't manage in India, I'll go back. So 30% will go back, but we have to give them extra skills so that they not only go to Gulf, they can go beyond Gulf. India, globally, we have 200 plus countries. Why we are going only to Gulf? I think time has come to talk about non-Gulf countries because the COVID going to bring opportunities everywhere. There will be a demand for migration. I don't think migration is going to end. Sorry, no. Migration will pick up. Next 6 months, everybody will talk about border. Even I cannot go from one district to another district. Forget about crossing the border today. So we cannot cross between district to district, state to state. Even state is telling, Karnataka was telling, you cannot, in Kerala, people cannot come to Karnataka. It's like they are giving visa to us. And so all this problem will be there for 6 months. So I think 2021 will be a bright, migration will open up and the Gulf is not going to close because we have a strong bond, social network. Because for example, I'm telling the Kerala people, we have 20 lakh migrants. They are not going to come back tomorrow. It will take 20 years to return these 20 lakhs. So it will continue, there will be problem. Second issue, nationalization policy.
Please conclude, Rajan sir.
Nationalization policy. What did we do? We are talking about 20 years. I heard about this in 2002. They will fail. They will fail. Third one, oil prices. I have seen oil price up to 120 barrel. Now you see here 40 airports in India, all are closed. all the flights were running around, stopped. Everybody started, I'm not taking my car out. So the petrol price will go up. I don't think we should talk too much on job loss in the Gulf. They will all will revive. Finally, amnesty. We are going to get little extra return migration this time. So I think every government should talk about return migration, rehabilitation, remigration. I think this should be focused this time. And then we should also focus beyond Gulf. I was telling to the Kerala CM, why there was no flight come from New York to Trivandrum. That means it indicates not many Keralites are in New York. We should send people to New York because they are dying. People are dying. There may be more people needed from Kerala nurses. There should be special flights should come next to COVID. We should have a flight from New York to India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajan sir. Thank you very much, Rajan sir. Really, I mean, every time I think Professor Rajan comes on board, I know for guarantee that I will have sound bites that I can always use, and these sound bites are very important. However, you know, I'm going back to the point that you made, that because we don't have data on return migration, if there is no number, you don't care for them. Strong words, Professor Rajan. I think it's important for us all to keep in mind what you're saying. But let's hope that is not the case. And I know for a fact that that is not the case. The Ministry of External Affairs, I understand, is keeping a database of all those who are returning to understand what kind of skills they're coming in with and how they can be reintegrated into the job market within India. So that's certainly something coming up. You're right. The conversations in India, the first thing that we say is India is the largest receiver of remittances in the world. Over $80 billion. Last year, $82 billion as per the World Bank estimates. When it comes to remittances for India. But again, perhaps not much in terms of GDP contribution, only about 2.5, 2.6% of the GDP. But I know, Professor Rajan, you will say in the case of Kerala, that's about 36% of the state GDP in Kerala. So that's massive. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that in India, we have to look at it from both the central and the state perspectives. And that is applicable across the board in South Asia. In Bangladesh, we have to look at it from Dhaka's perspective as much as we have to look at it from Sylhet's perspective. In Sri Lanka, as much as we look at it from Colombo's central government perspective to the returnees in Ampara, Batikalo, and so on, and likewise in every other country, Nepal, Pakistan as well. Okay, with that, I turn to my third speaker now, Mr. Ganesh, Dr. Ganesh Gurung. Dr. Ganesh Gurung is from the Nepal Institute of Development Studies and will speak about this from the Nepal context. Dr. Gurung, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me start with, like Rajan, I will start with some statistics. Nepal is a very hard hit by this hard hit to Nepal's economy by COVID-19. Let me tell you, the figure is nearly 1 million Nepali people are in Gulf countries. And in Nepal, we receive $8.1 billion every year in total as remittances, which is 19th biggest in the world in terms of economy. And out of 8.1 billion, 50% is from a Gulf country. So a very interesting part is Nepal, the remittances that we receive in Nepal is, in terms of a GDP equivalent, is 28% of the GDP. And that is very high figure in terms of Nepal. And, then this out of 50%, a largest percentage of remittances come from Qatar. Then because of this corona, in Gulf countries, 200 people are nearly 200 people are already infected by corona, and 34 have already died. So as Rajan also mentioned very clearly, this oil factor is also there because of oil price going down, and there is a big that Nepali people are getting unemployed in Gulf countries. So there are two types of Nepalese in Gulf now. One typology is they are supposed to return forcefully. They are made by the companies to return, or their conditions are very vulnerable, so they are forced to return. They are waiting to return to Nepal. And a second typology is a willingness to return to Nepal. And these are the two types, right? So the problem of Nepal is now, so a big issue that we are suffering in Nepal is these informal people are going to Gulf countries. Then we don't have data. We don't have data. Then we are at present now, as a member of a think tank of a Nepal government, right? I am given the task to prepare this data. So I am contacting to Nepali embassies of all the Gulf countries to provide me data. Second issue that we are suffering is this gender issue. Housemaids, mostly females, they are there. Many of them are pregnant, and many of them don't have access to embassy, and they call very occasionally, but they are in trouble. And third thing, a very interesting part is there are some countries in Gulf that they have asked the Nepal government, they have written me that they want to send back Nepali workers, like Kuwait. Kuwait has already sent me the list of 3,500 Nepalis, and many of them are housemaids. And Kuwait government is willingly, they are also going to pay the airfare also. An interesting part of in Nepal is because at present we have a lockdown situation in Nepal. So the Prime Minister of Nepal has spoken to most of the head of states of Gulf countries regarding the migrant workers, and the head of states of Gulf countries have assured over the telephone to the Prime Minister of Nepal that they will keep the Nepali workers until Nepal can take back, and they will take care of Nepali people as their citizen in the Gulf countries. So the impact of this is we have already a big unemployment rate in Nepal, and then we are out of this 1 million Nepalese in Gulf. We are expecting, and then I am doing some kind of modeling, and I am expecting that 25% of 1 million will return to Nepal. And the large challenge that it remains to us is how to reintegrate them, how to keep them in isolation or quarantine, or how to take them back to their respective villages, and how to provide them employment in Nepal. So this is the large discussion going on in Nepal. Thus, we think in Nepal we have large impact on unemployment sector, and later on food grain. That's what we are working on it, but this is unexpected. So we were not, Nepal was not prepared for it. So that is the a big problem in Nepal. But however, some strategies are being made. So we hope that we can receive these migrant workers from a Gulf country, and we can manage these people who are returning from Gulf. I will stop here. I will stop
Great.
here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gurung. Again, I really like how you brought about this conversation to those individuals and those people from Nepal. You know, one of the conversations that I've heard now in the context of listening to and understanding from some of the trade union leaders like GFONT, the Nepal Trade Union Confederation, the civil society organizations. I know quite a few civil society organizations are very active under an umbrella network called the National Network for Safe Migration, the NNSM in Nepal. And I hear lots of things about how hard the Nepal government is looking at the issues on particularly those who are returning. what I am always struck by is perhaps we as South Asians are less accepting of our own people. I've heard that when migrant workers return to their districts in Nepal, and this is not just in Nepal, I've heard about it even in India and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, they're treated as carriers of disease. So they are treated with a certain sense of stigma is attached to them coming back, that they don't have access to service in some of the districts to which they return to. And I think these are going to be big issues as we talk about reintegration. And I think we need to keep that in mind going forward. You mentioned about the role of diplomatic missions. Absolutely, that is going to be a priority over the next few months. It's always been a priority. Nepal has taken a very active role from its diplomatic side. Nepal has contributed in big ways to the discussions. Nepal still currently holding chair of the Colombo process, was chair of the SAARC when the SAARC declaration in 2014 integrated a specific agenda on paragraph 21 on labor migration. So in so many different ways, I think Nepal's government's leadership is unquestionable. But that takes me on to the next panelist, Dr. Nasra Shah from Pakistan, from the Lahore School of Economics. Dr. Shah, your time starts now. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Abri. First of all, it's very nice to see all of you, especially when I've been home like all of you for so many weeks. So it's nice to see so many friends today. And thanks to the organizers for such an invigorating panel. So what I'm going to do in the context of Pakistan is, first of all, spell out some specificities, because each of the South Asian countries has its own specificities. So let me begin by pointing out some of those, and then I will pick up on a couple of things that I think are going to be particularly important in the context of the COVID pandemic. So Pakistan is among those countries, probably second to India, which has among the longest historical links with the Gulf, because Gulf migration goes back to the early 70s. And Pakistan was one of the countries that started this migration very early on. And then with ups and downs, in 2015, almost 1 million migrants left the country in just 1 year. So in terms of the stock, I agree with Rajan that since we really don't collect this data, this is very patchy. So anywhere from maybe 3 to 5 to 6 million, maybe the stock in the Gulf. But 3 is a minimum that I would say, probably 4. Okay, one thing that kind of has come up a little bit is network connections. And I've looked at this in several of my research projects and find that network connections have been a major facilitator and have grown and enabled the informal sector and a lot of irregular migration, which I'll talk about a little bit. In the case of Pakistan, like other countries, even though there's a concentration of migrants from the north of the country, from the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or KPK, but migrants are drawn from literally all over the country. You look at the districts, almost every district is sending migrants. Rural areas are sending and urban areas are sending. One other specificity is that almost half of all the labor migrants from Pakistan are classified as low skilled or unskilled, and about 10% as highly skilled. So that's another important factor in terms of the vulnerabilities that the migrants migrant workers are likely to face. In terms of females, there are almost no domestic workers, at least no registered ones. And I have not really seen, I lived in the Gulf for 35 years in Kuwait and did not come across, and even in the other Gulf countries, I did not come across Pakistani domestic workers, females. And in other sectors, the female representation is fairly small, 5 to 10%, not more. Okay, now given the fact that Pakistanis are the second largest stocks of migrants in Pakistan, and they are drawn from all over the country, the impacts are likely to be very widespread, both in the rural and the urban areas. One of the things that I want to talk about is the networks, which I mentioned as a specificity. So the strength of the network connections will be under a lot of strain and will really be tested in the weeks and months to come. This will be especially true in case of situations where compatriots were acting as critical buffers and supporters in case of low-skilled workers occupied in the informal sector. Prior to the pandemic, it is estimated that 10 to 15% of the workers in the Gulf were employed there in irregular capacity. Now, again, this is an estimate, but Chabri in his introduction mentioned irregular. So anyone who is irregular is by definition more vulnerable. So the way that people could have become irregular is they could have overstayed their residence visa, they could have run away from the employer, or they may be on a so-called Azad visa, which is there in all the South Asian countries, where you work for, you buy the visa, and then you're working for someone else other than the employer, other than the sponsor, which is illegal. Okay, now with the occurrence of the COVID pandemic, those in an irregular status will face a especially risky and difficult future. At least 5 reasons will account for that. First of all, irregular workers would find it harder to hide from the authorities like they did before. And in a book that we published in 2017, we had looked at all the countries of the Gulf and the South Asia, and recorded many such instances. So they would find it harder to hide. Second, the network that supported and protected them will find it too risky to continue such support. Third, tracing of COVID contacts may reveal migrants who might have been sheltered by friends and relatives earlier. So they are not going to be willing or perhaps able to do that anymore. 4, sponsors who may have earlier provided a certain degree of facilitation and protection would be less likely to be willing to do so. It's going to be much riskier for them. Finally, the cordoning off and searches of high-risk areas seems to have added to this process already. Because there are areas in Kuwait that I'm told by my friends there that have been sealed off. And there are raids of buildings. And therefore, anyone in an irregular capacity, it's going to be really impossible for them to hide. Okay, then with the closure of businesses, workers at all skill levels will face job losses. Those in the low skill categories will face the highest risks, since many are employed in the informal sector and often have paid large sums of money, which came up earlier, to secure this job in the Gulf. So the recruitment cost for the low skilled has been very high. Then the sudden return of migrant workers will of course put a burden on the labor market, on the economy, and so on. So one of the things that I want to kind of highlight is that the Pakistan government, I read, is being pressured by the Gulf countries to actually accept back or to arrange for the return of their migrants. Now, I really wonder if, so who are those migrants that the Gulf is insisting the sending countries take back? If these people are just the ones who lost their job, why is it the sending country's responsibility to arrange for these people to come back? Okay, now, if they were in some kind of a vulnerable, irregular situation, perhaps I understand that a bit more, that since they were there in an irregular capacity, and now, okay, an amnesty has been declared, so now we want to
conclude, Professor Shah.
Right. Okay, so that's the final point that I want to make. I hope we can have some discussion on the right of labor rights. Where are labor rights in all of this? Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Shah. I think it's very important. This is a conversation around labor movements. This is a conversation on labor rights, and I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. I'm also struck by the very concise set of points you gave on irregularity. And the importance of social networks and so on. I mean, as an example, every time we talk about irregularity and regularization issues, we don't perhaps take into consideration the good examples that come from our corridors of work. And I think it's important to mention some of those best practices or good examples. For instance, the Qatar government recently issued a set of guidelines, and one of those guidelines particularly said, it doesn't matter whether you have a Qatari ID or not. Please come forward for your testing, for your screening, and and if necessary, we will provide you healthcare if you are infected. And I think that's very important for us to recognize. It's also important to recognize that as much as when Kuwait and UAE announced the amnesties in the Gulf countries, they also said from the Kuwaiti government, and Dr. Shah, you would know better, was about the fact that they wouldn't be detained, that they wouldn't be deported, that their airfares to their countries of origin will be paid for, and that they will not be barred from entering the country on a regular basis in that 10-year period, which is usually the case that happens for deportees. Nevertheless, I think you have touched on some very critical points on the irregularity of this and how it affects and how that links into COVID. And we'll come into those points as well. Our final South Asia speaker, certainly not the least, Bilesha Weeraratne, a prominent expert in the Sri Lanka context. Bilesha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Shabri, and thank you to all the organizers also for giving me this opportunity. So first of all, let me start off by giving a little bit of context about Sri Lankan labor migration situation. In the recent years, labor migration in Sri Lanka has been going down in terms of numbers. So in 2019, the total number of departures was 203,000, which was about 4% lower than the previous year. Now, I just want to give you the numbers and tell that in the context of the South Asian countries, the numbers in Sri Lanka may be small, but for the Sri Lankan economy, these numbers are very significant. So out of these 203 plus migrant workers from Sri Lanka, about 60% were males. And there was a high component of female domestic workers, about 30%. And again, if you look at the skill level, only about 14% migrant workers were professional or high skilled workers. So majority were on the lower skill realm in the skill distribution. And in terms of destinations, the Middle East countries account for about 85% of Sri Lankan migrants on an annual basis. And out of the Middle Eastern countries, the key countries are Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Those are the key 4 countries. In 2019, Qatar became the top destination for Sri Lanka Kuwait became the top destination, overtaking Qatar. All these years, Qatar has been a key destination, but last year, Kuwait overtook. Now, along with these departures, we are all concerned about the remittances. So in terms of remittances also, again, in the South Asian scale, what Sri Lanka gets is small. Last year, we got 6.7 billion US dollars, and it accounted for about 8% of our GDP. I know when you compare to Nepali statistics, it's not much, but this is a key component of foreign exchange earner to Sri Lanka. And it plays a huge role in the Sri Lankan economy, because if you look at the micro context, about 1 in every 11 households would get remittances. So at the micro level, households rely a lot on labor migration and related remittances. So let's see what happened with the spread of the pandemic in Sri Lanka, in the context of Sri Lanka. So as we all know, by mid-March, many of our destination countries had temporary bans on certain countries, passengers from certain countries, and Sri Lanka was affected right from the beginning itself. And on top of that, Sri Lankan Regulatory Authority, the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, imposed another ban from Sri Lankan side, saying that no migrant worker registered with the SLBFE could leave for foreign employment until further notice. So because of this, roughly on a monthly basis, about 17,000 people depart for foreign employment. So if we look from mid-March to now, we have lost roughly somewhere between 35,000 to 40,000 employment opportunities. And in addition to people, the potential migrants not being able to go, there have been a huge demand for migrant workers of Sri Lankan origin to come back. So now, as we all know, there were different types of migrant workers who are wanting to come back during this context. Some were who had already finished their contract and they were anyway planning to come, but then there were another segment of migrants who were affected by this pandemic, the COVID-19, and wanted to come back. Some were laid off, some were underemployed or feared getting unemployed soon. And then also there was a segment of migrant workers who were panic-stricken. They had a secure job, but they just wanted to come back. They just want to come back. So, but something that migrants wanting to return have to take into context is the situation in the country, in Sri Lanka also. So now Sri Lanka has had a lockdown for about 2 months, and there's a lot of unemployment in the country as it is. So those who are coming will face a country that is suffering economically right now. So the projections show that Sri Lanka will contract by about, World Bank says, early estimates of the World Bank say that we will contract by about 0.5%, but other estimates say we might contract between 1 to 3%. So the economy is not going to look good in 2020. So those coming back to Sri Lanka from the Middle East, migrant workers will be hit hard in the local labor market as well, just like in the rest of the South Asian countries. Now, in terms of remittances also, we have the latest numbers. If you look at monthly remittances, March is a traditionally high remitting month for Sri Lanka because it's right before the Sinhala and Tamil New Year festival, which falls in April. So people normally send a lot of money in March. But unfortunately, in 2020, the remittances in March contracted by 14% compared to the previous year, mainly because even though migrant workers had money in hand, they were not able to remit because of the lockdown situation in the Middle East. So there was serious concerns about remittance channels, and this over-reliance on brick and mortar channels affected this remitting capacity of many of the migrant workers who had the money in hand in March. And also then when we look at April numbers, we have the April statistics. April shows very bad situation. Remittances to Sri Lanka in April declined by 32%. That's a staggering 1/3 drop in April. So this gives the indication where it's heading for the rest of the year. So actually the World Bank predicts about a 20% decline. So this 33% decline shows if it continues, it's going to be around 20% or more. So the estimates are consistent with what's going on. And then we also should have to factor in the economy in the Middle Eastern countries. So though the countries are going to contract, I think the IMF estimates about a 2.7% contraction in the Middle East region. So that will affect demand for labor for migrant workers, their wages, their capacity to remit. So things are not going to be easy. So all in all, we have a lot of people wanting to come back, not able to go. So if you look at the segment of migrant workers wanting to come back home, who have already come back to Sri Lanka, we have to think about their return and reintegration, as it was mentioned many times ago. So Sri Lanka has a good labor migration policy, and within that we have a sub-policy on return and reintegration. But unfortunately, this return and reintegration situation is not the normal traditional return and reintegration situation where somebody might have achieved his or her target and come back, or even if he failed with his migration ambition, at least the country of origin, Sri Lanka, might have a different scenario. But now Sri Lanka is in turmoil, the migrant returning is in turmoil, his family has had such a lot of distress, layoff, not being able to get income, not being able to collect the remittances. So it's going to be a very difficult situation.
Malaysia, please conclude. Go ahead.
Okay. So finally, I want to touch on this repatriation efforts. Sri Lanka has been doing good in terms of repatriation, and recently we have started the repatriation of people who have been given the amnesty in Kuwait. But then during the last 2-3 days, Sri Lanka was shocked to see what was happening. Yesterday reported the highest number of COVID patients in Sri Lanka. It was 137 patients as per the news reports. Out of these 137 patients, 127 were returnees from Kuwait, those who were repatriated. So this shows the challenge the government has. Government has to bring back the workers, Sri Lankan citizens, but then in terms of caring for them, we have to have sufficient quarantine facilities to cater to them, to take care of their health needs. But then I kind of see a mismatch here. Now, Kuwait extended an excellent amnesty program. Kudos to them, highly appreciated, because it gives further return migration opportunities also. But I think one area that was not looked at is about the vulnerability of the migrants who are coming under this program, because it looks as if they were infected while they were in Kuwait and there had not been tests done before they left Kuwait, and the entire burden somehow falls into the Sri Lankan government. So that is a little bit of a mismatch. I think these things as a region we have to address, as a sending region we have to address, and try to expect or request the receiving countries or the countries of destination also to collaborate and address these needs in this sort of a situation. I think I'll wind up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bilesha. Much appreciated. I'm glad you pointed out, I think from yours, what clearly came out was the remittances angle. I mean, gosh, 32%. What a drop in remittances. This was from April, you mentioned, Bilesha. I think that's a big number. And let's accept it. Remittances is an important part of labor migration. There are families that are depending on it, on this money sent back, families of migrant workers. So I don't think we should ever discount the importance of remittances. It is an important aspect. I know that we've heard previously as well, the World Bank estimates 20 to 25%. This year, we will see a total, kind of slowdown in remittance flows into the countries of origin. So the coming from in April going down by 32%, I think is a big impact for a lot of families, I can imagine. Thanks also for talking about return and reintegration, Bilesha, because Sri Lanka, let's point out, is the only country in South Asia which has a sub-policy on return and reintegration. And I think that's very important to keep in mind in its broader national labor migration policy, which Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, they all have, but Sri Lanka is the only country which has a sub-policy on return and reintegration. So thanks for pointing out to these elements, Bilesha, very important. I have now, I want to give a few minutes to some speakers out there who quite a few prominent experts that we have attending with us. So let me thank all of you. I think everybody. I see 193 participants right now, and I really thank everybody for taking the time out for this. I think that's very important, given the fact that you are spending this time with us in listening to these experts. I want to point out, I may not be able to give the floor to anybody, but I also mentioned about Professor Binod Kadria. Apart from him, I also recognize the presence of Ambassador Manju Seth, the former Indian ambassador, I understand, is present now. I understand that Ambassador Pietro Mona, who is the Swiss ambassador for migration, displacement, and development with the Swiss government, is the international ambassador at large. is also present with us. I see the presence of Ms. Ellen Sana from the Philippines. I noticed that Gayatri Kant, who is with the International Organization for Employers, is present with us. Patrick Taran from the Global Migration Policy Associates and a former ILOer himself. So always a pleasure to have you, Patrick. Mr. Arvind Francis from FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry is here. Professor Pushpendra Kumar from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Professor Mizanur Rahman from Qatar, I understand, is here. Professor Chandrasekhar Bhatt, Professor Brij Maharaj, Professor Kamala Ganesh, and Professor Margaret Walton Roberts. So quite a few prominent names who have joined us today. And really, I think I couldn't thank you enough. But let me perhaps, I want to take this opportunity because it's a nice opportunity. So 2 minutes, and really a tough 2 minutes. I can see Professor Kadria with a smile on his face already. So Professor Kadria, 2 minutes, your reflections, and I will give it to a few other people. Please, sir.
Thank you, Sabri. Well, it's fascinating to listen to all the eminent panelists on different countries' perspectives and what is going to come. So I will just make observations within the 2 minutes that you have given. One is about the role of the state. The role of the state comes into prominence in all these countries. And I think in the context of COVID-19, we need to look at what the countries can and are doing at the time of crisis, because otherwise the role of the state is always there, but it has to gear up at time of crisis, and that's in the short run. And then we have to have what are the backup policies for the long run that are very, very important. Having said that, I think what is important in this context is not only to look at mortality rates because of COVID, but also morbidity rate, because it is the morbidity rate which is going to affect the economy, the productivity, and all these things about remittances and other things that we are talking about, which is actually the lifeline of migration from the Gulf, is going to be affected by morbidity conditions. And I think we need to look at that. The second issue that I'll be interested, I think at the time of discussion, we can throw light on these, is the intra-Asian migration that you had mentioned, intra-South Asian migration that you had mentioned right in the beginning. And I think some of the pointers came out during some presentations, like Nasra mentioned about irregular migration. Now, what about irregular migration between India, between Bangladesh and India? I think all the countries, including Nepal and so are concerned about this. But if we look at the trajectory, how the timing of COVID affecting was at a time when India was sizzling under these conditions of the issues about irregular migration and citizenship amendments and things like that. So this is the background in which we need to situate the discourse, which would give us the insights into what is going to come once the vaccine comes, once the COVID impact subsides, say until September, as my friend Irudaya has said, that come September and we will see what is going to come. Then what after that? That I think is the biggest point. Other than that, of course, many other issues have been raised. You mentioned about Sri Lanka. I think reconciliation of the diaspora is a very important issue. And I was there to give a keynote address about a year and a half back. So that change, I can see the perspective is changing. What about the Tamil diaspora and the Sri Lankan diaspora? And similarly, other issues in the context of intra-South Asian migration. Can there be a South Asian, trans-South Asian alliance in the coming days, in the coming times? Can we think together? Can we have the brainstorming on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kadria. Really, as always, listening to you, role of the state. So if I may then take this opportunity to look at either a former or a current state representative. Ambassador Seth, if you're there and if you would like to take the floor, there's no announcement on this. It's really a fly-by nature. So if you would like to take the floor, and Ambassador Pietro Mona, former colleague of mine who I know is present. Ambassador Seth, if you're there, and would you like to take the floor?
Good evening, and this is a wonderful.
Thank you, Ambassador. You're on mute, Ambassador. Yes, yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
It's been such a pleasure and such a learning experience hearing from all of you, and you are moderating it wonderfully. And such eminent speakers from all over South Asia, I think, have contributed and given us such a good perspective. And the states, I was just thinking that if Professor Rajan or any of the others have any suggestions, policy suggestions for the state governments and the central government to be able to have a clear-cut reintegration policy for the reverse migrants, and also whether all the South Asian countries together can take up with the host countries a better level playing field for the Indian migrants from South Asian migrants from all the South Asian countries, so that the irregular migrants can be taken care of instead of a regular amnesty all the time. Amnesties are all very well, but they're all uncertain and don't provide any clarity of sort of how to take things forward for all these people. So whether all of us can, because we have, they're contributing immensely to the economy, migrants from South Asia, as also specifically for the domestic workers. I think we need to really all be on one page and take up with the host countries of how to give these workers a better deal, because very often they don't have a proper a voice, and their contracts may or may not be valid over a period of time. Many of them go as tourists on tourist visas and then get converted to domestic workers, and they're totally out of the picture. And so whether we can really look at some policy for them and to take up with the host countries to ensure that they get a better deal.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Seth. Really appreciate you being here. And thank you for actually indulging us. I know this was not something that we had prepared for right at the beginning, but your experience is very important for us to hear here. So thank you so much for that. Ambassador Pietro Mona, and if I may leave out the ambassador and the Mona and just say Pietro, my a good friend and the ambassador from Switzerland, if he is around. Pietro, would you like to say a few words?
Well, good afternoon and, and good evening, colleagues. Yeah, Shabri has this tendency of putting me on the spot. So I should have preemptively prepared something knowing that might happen. But anyway, let me just thank you all for this very inspiring insights in national context where I dare to say the government of Switzerland has worked with many of you as partners in the past. We've been working together with the government of Nepal and Bangladesh and others, but also with the governments on the receiving end, to really look at and better understand the importance of addressing the challenges in these migration corridors. Obviously, COVID has now uprooted many of these realities, has changed the face of the context in which we are working, has presented new challenges, but has probably certainly also unearthed existing challenges that we have to tackle. Many of them have been addressed by the distinguished panelists before, and let me just point out a couple of them. So on remittances, for example, indeed, I mean, the numbers are staggering, and this is what we're looking at. COVID really has to be understood not only as a short-term health crisis, which we really have to deal with. And this is in itself a huge task. I think the international community has come together strongly on that. But I think the issue of remittances and so many more shows how long we will deal with the negative impacts that COVID will have on the social, economic, cultural level. And I think this is where we really have to start looking ahead, planning ahead, understanding what measures have to be taken. Very practically, I just take this opportunity. Last Friday, the government of Switzerland, together with the government of the UK and other governments have already joined us, has launched a call to action on remittances and trying to highlight some concrete policy actions that can be taken both by the governments, but also by the private enterprises, by the regulators, to really try to keep these remittances channels open also during the crisis that we are in. I look at a couple of governments that have already joined in. I see Pakistan, for example, from the region. It has just been launched. We are reaching out to many governments, and I hope many more governments will join us in this. It is supported also by several UN agencies, IOM, UNDP, UNCDF, the World Bank. So I think it really tries to be very practical in times. More at the macro level, I think a pitch that I'm usually making, and I take this opportunity, let's not forget a 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I think this is so hugely important because all the challenges that we're seeing now when it comes to poverty, when it comes to inequalities, when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, also something that we've seen in the context of migration coming up more, the challenges of having refugee children or migrant children not being able to go to school, so the challenges around education. All of this and much more is encapsulated in the 2030 Agenda. So this is really a period where we have to double down on the importance of the 2030 Agenda. Much more to say, but again, I was really here just to listen to the expertise coming from the region. I took the liberty of pitching some ideas, but I'm now really much looking forward to hearing again from the experts from the region. Thank you, Shabri, and thank you to all the very distinguished panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pietro. Really appreciate you being here. And thank you for reinforcing the 2030 development agenda. There is never a bad moment to reiterate it. There's never a bad moment to reinforce it. It is important. That is the basis on which we're talking about development. And if it is about reintegration, then it's goal 8. If it is about women, it's goal 4. If it is about inequalities, it's goal 10. If it is about partnerships, it's goal 17. So let's keep all of that in mind as we move forward when it comes to COVID as well. Look, I think it's important to also we have two more very eminent speakers. We've got Froilan Mallet Jr., who will give a short perspective on the Filipino perspective, and of course Andrew, who will then really take us to the Gulf, take us off there. So thank you for your patience, Froilan and Andrew. I appreciate it. I want to perhaps give the floor to one other stakeholder here. We always, I think it's important to recognize the role of private sector and the employers. And I see the presence of Ms. Gayatri Kant from the International Organization for Employers, also a constituent of the International Labour Organization. Gayatri, if you are hearing us and if you would like to take the floor and say something, a quick short 1 minute, that would be great. No, no Gayatri. Gayatri's left. Okay, so in that case, I still recognize the presence of Mr. Arvind Francis, who I mentioned right at the beginning from FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And if Mr. Francis is still there, Mr. Francis, we'd be happy to hear from you on the employer's perspective.
Thank you, Shabri, for inviting me, first of all. And it was really a great experience to hear all the distinguished speakers. And many things were really eye-openers to understand for the different countries how migration is affecting the respective countries. And here, you know, in India, we are currently also grappling with the internal interstate. Also, I mean, Mr. Professor has rightly said that this COVID has brought a lot of things which were silent in this migrant thing, which has come to the forefront, and we could see that these are the real issues. Not only for the interstate migrants, but also for the international migrants. And now, since a lot of migrants are coming back to India, yes, in India, we have the challenge that we do not have anything for resettling the migrants which are coming back. There's no integration policy for that. So there is still a lot of work which needs to be done in terms of Indian perspective, I would say. That's all from me, Shabri.
Great. No, thank you so much. It's always good to hear the employer's perspective. And the very fact that you're here, that Gayatri was here from the IOE, shows that there is a big role that the employers have to play in this conversation. I mean, when we talk about reintegration, a migrant worker is no more a migrant worker when he or she returns. They're just workers, and they're workers with skills and experience that can be utilized for the development and for how they can contribute to their countries of origin. So with that said, I'd like to now call on Froilan. Froilan, you have the floor for 7 minutes. Please go ahead with regards to the Filipino perspective and perhaps a link to the Abu Dhabi dialogue. Go ahead.
Thank you. You can hear me perfectly, right?
Yes, great.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers. So COVID-19, it's an exceptional crisis placed in an exceptional moment in contemporary times. And given this context, I aim to look at the politics of Philippine repatriation from the Gulf and migrants' resistance. And I want to ask two specific questions. Why do these migrants resist, all these repatriation schemes? And what are the domestic and foreign policy implications, for the Philippine state? Now, there's three things I want to look at here: the similarities of Philippine South Asia, the differences, and the potential interventions that are necessary to understand this dynamic. So Philippines, it's been touted as sort of a key best practice for a lot of sending states for a long time, but the COVID experience has really tested its ability to protect, and in fact, the experiences of the Philippines is not very different from a lot of these South Asian countries. In fact, we've survived a lot of crises in the past: Libyan conflict in 2014, Iraq 2003, Kuwait 1990s, and Lebanon as well. Now, with COVID-19, it did deepen and expose power asymmetries and capacities of sending countries like the Philippines and South Asian countries to react in a crisis migration context. Now, what are the similarities? Well, as you said, the high proportion of vulnerable migrants, displaced, stranded, those irregular migrants with irregular children, aging migrants, migrants with disabilities, etc. Low fiscal budget between Philippines and South Asian countries, massive institutional and political pressures, especially within these diplomatic missions. It's a real test of political legitimacy for sending countries. Population constraints, both local and abroad. Migrants were seen as liabilities before, assets before. Now they're turning into liabilities from a state perspective. The internal and sort of international migrants, the drop in remittances, and the demonization of migrant narratives. Now, all these similarities, with certain variances, they actually tell you two things. One, that sending countries need to integrate a crisis context more vigorously in their migration governance in the long run. And the second thing is that they need to holistically integrate, local and foreign policy institutions, to better prepare themselves in these crisis contexts. Now, what are the differences between, the Philippines and South Asian countries? I mean, I would argue that there are three differences that we need to look into when we try to see Philippines as an example. So the one is actually, migrant defiance, and the propensity of Filipino workers to stay than return relative to other South Asian countries. The second is, how do these migrant defiance shapes the Philippine state behavior responses? Because what happens is you can't really repatriate if people don't want to be repatriated, right? And that has massive political and economic costs for the Philippine state. And the third thing is, what does this defiance mean? What kind of tensions does it create? Intra-agency tension, right? And diplomatic tensions between the Philippine state and the host states. So let me break it down, these three elements, very quickly. So the migrant defiance. So as I said, Filipinos, there's more propensity to stay than return. And this has been historically proven in the case of Libya, where we sent a lot of ships to actually repatriate Filipinos in 2014. Yet a lot of Filipinos defied that policy and chose to stay because there are no opportunities back home. So currently, there are 27,000 Filipinos who requested to be repatriated out of 3 million Filipinos. Think about that, 27,000 only at the moment. And 4,700 Filipinos have been repatriated already. Now, this is good and bad. It's good because it gives, a buying time for the Philippine state to prepare, right? Because Filipinos are still resisting. But it's also not good because it extends more pain, more debts, more suffering, for a lot of Filipino workers who are struggling to provide for their family. It shifts deeper institutional responsibility. And this defiance is actually embedded in the lack of trust that the Philippine state can actually provide, for the Filipino workers. So what you see here is actually this tension that's being played out in both historical and contemporary contexts. So that's number one, this defiance, right? And how it challenges the capacity and the power of the Philippine state to govern and protect its nationals outside. So the second one is, well, what does this defiance mean, right? How does it shape the Philippine state's behavior? Well, because a lot of workers don't want to be repatriated, the Philippine government doesn't know what to do with them, right? So in this case, they don't have a clear contingency strategy at the moment. So what they end up doing is they're employing two things. One, an optional repatriation scheme, right? With a focus on vulnerable migrants. And the second one is actually a social amelioration scheme where they offer $200 to 250,000 Filipino workers, both land-based and sea-based globally. Now, what does that tell you is that the Philippine state is focused more on offering short-term assistance, but not really, fully addressing these issues. And the figures, 250,000 versus sort of 10 million Filipinos outside, that's a huge, contradictory in terms of like how the Philippine state has been viewed. Now, they're not really coherent because they're caught in this dilemma because they have to protect 100 million Filipinos inside and 10 million outside. So, the assistance that they provided, it showed a symbolic protection, right? That the Philippine state that they can protect. But at the same time, it also undermines them because it exposed, right, the limits of the Philippine state to extend protection. So in a way, when Filipino workers don't want to be repatriated, it creates confusion, right? It creates a lot of issues for the Philippine state because they don't know exactly what to do, right? And the last part is the defiance part. What does this defiance mean in terms of looking at, the institutional tension that's happening in the country? So, for example, the biggest problem right now in the Philippines is that the interagency unit in the Philippines can only repatriate 400 Filipino workers on a daily basis. Now, there is a tension actually between the Philippine Senate and the Philippine diplomatic missions because the Senate are basically saying we can only repatriate 400 Filipino workers. And remember, you have 3 million Filipino workers and you have about 170,000 Filipino workers who have been displaced in the Gulf countries. So there is this issue of capacity, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Please
so I think, what do we need to do now, right? What can we learn from this? Well, there are three things that I would want to suggest. One, the role of interregional consultative dialogue. These things have not been really addressed. A lot of countries have been looking at their unilateral interests. So the Colombo process and the Abu Dhabi dialogue, these are very, very important. And I think in the future, they need to integrate a crisis migration framework within their regional agendas in the long run. The second one is actually, as Gulf countries are passing more restrictive, tougher policies like VAT, localization, deportation policies, I think sending countries need to really understand that these are real political tests, right, to their migration framework that they've been developing for decades, right? And there are costs and challenges to these. But remember, a lot of them, they do have the constitutional responsibility to protect, and I think they need to uphold that. The third thing is actually the need to reshape diplomatic missions. So the Philippine government right now is trying to add, a health attaché to be deputized within the Philippine, diplomatic missions, because for a long time, there's always been, labor attaché, trade attaché, but not of a health attaché. And that's something that's like very, very crucial in the long run. And the last point I want to make, Fabri, is that state matters, right? And diplomacy is an even more powerful tool for a lot of states, to actually assert the rights and welfare of workers. And these issues have been happening for decades, right? Like, did we really have to wait for COVID for us to understand that these things have been happening, right? So I think it's a matter of in which states govern and actually develop their institutions to address. So I think a crisis migration framework is literally necessary now. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Froilan. Thanks so much for coming in. The Filipino experience is always one that the South Asians have valued. So I think it's important to recognize what Philippines has had to contribute in terms of the broader migration policy. And it's important to keep that in mind. I mean, I know, for instance, a reintegration policy discussed in any of the South Asian countries will always have a Filipino experience attached to it, as an example. The diplomatic missions that you spoke about, Philippines is perhaps right at the forefront in terms of how to manage a good coordinated diplomatic arrangement to make sure that Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Department of Labor, now you say health, for instance, they're all coming together. I think really Philippines has been a very good example for all of us in the region to learn from. So thanks for that. I agree, crisis migration framework within a Abu Dhabi dialogue setting. I mean, I think it's very important for us to take that into the regional processes and the regional conversations. So great. Thanks so much, Froilan. And now I go to Andrew Gardner. Andrew, take us to the Gulf, take us to the Arabian shores, and tell us what life is from as an anthropologist, and how do you think we need to view these things? Thanks, Andrew. You have the floor.
Shabari, thank you so much for this moderation, and I'm very honored to be a part of this and speaking to you all. I know my time is short, and I have 7 points that I hope to get to in this very brief moment. And so the first thing I'd like to say, as I was listening to Dr. Bilesha, thinking about Sri Lanka and the many Sri Lankan migrants that I've spoken with over the last 2 decades, it really occurred to me that this pandemic that we're all mired in and trying to grapple with at this moment, I think in a few years, it would very much, in the future, it will resemble one of those push factors, one of those factors that continues to push migrants to seek remuneration from the Gulf states. And so I guess I'm thinking about also our capacity to see this pandemic as yet another in a long sequence of push factors causing the kinds of frictions that drive migration. The second point that I wanted to bring up was that the Gulf cities, the Gulf states, the migration industry that facilitates these movements, all of this is premised on the same global mobility that this virus lives on, right? This virus and this pandemic has traveled on the same conduits and the same routes that we move about this planet on. And just that coincidence, I think, is something that we need to always sort of keep in the back of our mind. Third, I'm sort of shifting to my urbanist perspective here. I think that the pandemic conditions have really shifted some of the fundamental gravity of the urban, right? Our togetherness, our consolidation, our conglomeration in the urban milieu, this has been changed. That proximity is suddenly dangerous, right? And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because in the Gulf, especially, so many of the projects that migrants are there to work on are urban projects, right? And so the entire sort of foundational logic of urbanism, I think, has been called into question, at least momentarily, by the presence of this global pandemic. And who knows how that will affect the opportunities for migration, but it's certainly something that I'm keeping an eye on. Fourth, any of us who've ever spent time sort of looking at the situation of migrants in the Gulf states is aware that there is an enclaving and a segregation in the urban space of the Gulf that's very common. Migrants, labor camps, and migrants are usually situated in particular places. I think that we need to look at the spatial politics present in the cities of the Gulf. That's a problem. That is certainly, that kind of segregation seems extremely problematic, but it's also, I think we need to recognize it as a tool, right? By which states are seeking to combat the spread of this virus. And it's a dangerous tool. And I think I am very curious as to how the Gulf states and the cities are going to be navigating the use of this tool in ways that are attentive to the rights and the lives of the migrants who live in these zones, in these districts, and in these spaces. Fifth, I just wanted to briefly mention that I think it's important that we keep in mind the Gulf states are not a homogeneous unit, and that there are notable differences between the Gulf states. One of the variables that I'm particularly interested in is, does the relative openness of a state like Qatar open to research, open to people like me interviewing and counting migrants, is that openness going to reverberate in the sort of capacity to deal with and cope with this global pandemic? Something I'm curious about. Sixth, and these points I'm drawing from the wonderful talks that we had earlier. I wanted to know, there was been a lot of questions and a lot of talk about domestic workers or housemaids. And I wanted to note that the very factors that make domestic workers so vulnerable in the kafala or the sponsorship system, their isolation, residence in the households in which they use, the lack of communication with the outside world, strangely, in pandemic conditions, that's also a positive, right? That insulates them from the kind of crowded conditions that many other South Asian migrants encounter in the Gulf states. And so there's this strange irony with domestic workers, I think, in that their location in the households actually provides them with some modicum of insulation from the vulnerabilities of infection. And then lastly, there's also been a lot of very interesting and valuable talk about irregular migration. And again, I wanted to note that in my own work, and I think others are attentive to this as well, that this irregular migration and this illegality in the sponsorship system in the Gulf states is a two-edged sword, right? Yes, it's illegal and renders migrants more vulnerable to deportation, to certain kinds of exploitation, to state infractions. At the same time, these migrants, many of them who choose to become illegal migrants, are not dupes, structural dupes, to use Anthony Giddens' words. These choices reflect the fact that there are freedoms, right? In a rigid, inflexible labor market, this illegal labor allows migrants to switch between employers. And I'm curious as to how that agility and that flexibility rendered illegally in the labor markets of the Gulf might allow migrants to better navigate the dilemmas of the pandemic in the Gulf states and the cities therein. So there are some of the issues that come to mind in hearing these wonderful talks. And again, Shabari, thank you for your moderation, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share my perspective on the Gulf states.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Andrew. You know, just noting down your 7 points, push factors. Gosh, how much should we talk about push factors, and how much should we focus on decent work at home? Isn't reintegration about first decent work at home? I'm glad you speak about the urban milieu, the role of cities, because, you know, I know that a lot of people in the global migration discourse will say how important cities are in this context. Whether it is interstate migration within India or whether it's international migration, let's not forget these people are coming back to a certain town, to a certain city, to a certain area within a state, and therefore the local governance structure in these places are so pivotal. Thanks for pointing out that Gulf states are not homogeneous, and it's so important for us to keep that in mind. How Qatar would react to UAE is different from how Kuwait would react to Oman. In Oman, perhaps a much more of a common system for people in the Omanis in the workforce than in perhaps other countries. So really, I think that kind of a conversation is very important. I'm glad you pointed out. Of course, we say domestic workers, Andrew, and it's important to keep in mind that these are very important. You know, that brings in the female migration, the women migration, the vulnerabilities that women go through much more than men, perhaps not even as a part of the labor law in a lot of these countries. So it's important to recognize that. So thanks so much, Andrew, for all those points, the 7 points. I think you're my 7th commandment person. Appreciate it, Andrew. Right now, I know that it's time to actually look into some questions. We need to hear from the panelists themselves. They've heard a lot. So what I would do is, rather than give each one of you a question that a lot of people have raised. I mean, the chat box is full of questions. So I have received quite a few questions. What I will do is perhaps link into a few of those. I hear this conversation. I'm hearing or I'm reading about what are we talking about? Gender insights in the context of Bangladesh. So how specifically can we? Because and perhaps Dr. Hassan, you can also, because Bangladesh is the next big sending country for women migrant workers now. So perhaps something for you to consider and come in as well. In fact, it was a question raised by Ambassador Saith as well, is does the Bangladesh government have a plan to integrate returnees in their hometowns? So going back to that town, to that district, the district of Khulna, let's say. And so how will the district of Khulna react to this? So I think important questions here. There were a few other questions. I saw this one from Santosh Gyawali, where he asks Professor Gurung whether the better action of Nepali government to manage Gulf returnees. So again, more on the reintegration aspects as well. There is a question to Bilesha with regards to South Asian migrants working in the informal sector, but especially women domestic workers. And we know, Bilesha, I mean, out of the migrant worker population from Sri Lanka, 34% are women. And that is really, there is no comparison to that in South Asia. So Sri Lanka is really at the forefront, and a lot of conversations on women migration in the Sri Lanka policy discourse. I think it's important to recognize that. Professor Margaret Walton-Roberts raises, she says, great presentation so far. Question for Dr. Rajan from Professor Margaret Walton-Roberts. She says, what areas do you think Skills India should be focusing on in order to assist in the remigration options of the COVID returnees, especially in order to diversify possible migration destinations? So I think, Professor Rajan, if you could also talk about the Skills India focus that you spoke about, and how does that link into reintegration? There are quite a few other questions also to Professor Shah. There is one which is, can you throw, this is from Dr. Munir Illat, who asks, can you throw some lights on the extent of mobility of unskilled labor force to skilled and less vulnerable? So people who can move across those skill barriers or those skill gaps, can you see that as something that is possible? And we know this is always a difficulty in certain Gulf countries where they're not necessarily able to take forward these things. So these are a few questions that have come up. Please feel free to reflect on them and other things that you've heard. So I'll perhaps give the six panelists about 2 minutes each. That will really bring us close to the end of this session. And then I want to recognize the presence of, I mentioned Ellen Sana is here from the Philippines. Ellen, it would be always good to hear from you. Rula Hamati from the Cross Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, CCRM, from the Middle East is also present, I understand. And the regional coordinator, someone who has played a big role in so many different ways to the conversations on civil society strengthening and its work in the region, William Goyes from Migrant Forum Asia, a friend, a mentor, a guide. I think it's also important to hear from William. So let's say 7 + 3, 10 people, 2 minutes each. Go, we'll start again. Dr. Ehsan Ullah.
I see that quite a number of questions on a reintegration, and for Bangladesh context. And I know that we know this word, but we don't see anything in action. And you may ask why and how is it? Primarily, that as after 17 of March 2020, our government declared one, I don't know how to call it in English, incentive budget, something is around 72,000 crore. I have not converted into dollars. So 72,000 crore taka. So it's Bangladeshi currency, and it is a half of the money has been allocated to the bankers and some industrialists, and not a single penny for agriculture, not a single penny for migrants. So we hear a lot of things about the integrations, and they are welcomed by the government when they return, and they have so many incentives, but not a single penny for them from this huge budget. So that is, we can actually conclude that. I don't want to go deep into that. And another factor, that is the gender issues that came in, and I looked at the question, and the female migrants that who are now residing in the Middle East or GCC countries, wherever, and they started basically in 2016, just 4 years ago, because the minister on the particular ministry had a kind of pressure that we have to increase the number of female heads going out. So we don't want to be represented like the 1% female, that who is actually very low as compared to the Philippines, to Thailand, to the Sri Lanka, to Indonesia, but we did it. And we know very well that the Bangladeshi females are actually still not ready to go. And what happens? After just 3 months, hundreds and thousands are coming back without anything. I just give you an example. In the airport, we saw that in one day, 28 female migrants from Gulf states, they came back, and all of their belongings fit into one trolley. 28 migrants. So you know, they didn't bring anything with them. The brutality. Why I'm mentioning this because the secretary of the expatriate welfare ministry, she said these are the stories of brutalities are made up stories. So you see, from the policy they said this is we ignore, we take it so lightly, and when they came back with nothing, and they in a society like Bangladesh, they said we have been raped by the sons, by the owners, by the relatives, but it has been explained that this is so. You see, these are the things, and reintegration is one thing.
Dr. Ehsan, can we finalize?
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm done. Yeah, thanks.
No, really appreciate you saying that, and I think it's so important for us to think COVID is not the first time that migrant workers are going through problems. Yeah. COVID is just one of the many times that migrant workers are going through these issues. I mean, there's resilience that migrant workers have, I think is really unbeatable. So thank you so much for pointing that out. Professor Rajan, you have the floor.
Can you hear me, Sabri? Yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have looked at all the questions, so I want to pick up 1 or 2 points. One is that COVID has no corridor. It goes everywhere. So there is no corridor for South Asia Gulf. It has no borders. It don't require visa, anything. So it can go anywhere. Like migrants. It's like migrants. Second point, the undocumented migrants we were talking about, please remember, at least 20 to 30% of the South Asian migrants in the Gulf are undocumented. Not some small number, 20 to 30%. And please remember that itself indicates there is a parallel shadow labor market. That means there are jobs. So the Gulf is not going to close. I think it will reopen in a very massive way. That is very important for us to keep in mind. The third point I want to make is that return migrants rehabilitation, we can think of opening up. I'm telling to the Kerala government, opening up a employment exchange for return migrants. Especially, it is like the Kerala matrimony. You want to connect people, boys and girls, you have to connect migrants, plumber, welders, so that the people can be picked up. Some type of organizing them. People know some connection. Nair matrimony, Yerava matrimony. Why? You are connecting, so you can think of a very specialized idea for return migrant rehabilitation. And Skill India can pick up them and slowly package them, because we have to go beyond Gulf. I don't want only to Gulf to concentrate. And finally, I want to make one point which is very important. COVID bringing us the health issues of migrants. Andrew Gardner talks about health issues. Please remember, even in normal condition, migrants die earlier than non-migrants. Please remember this point. Migrants die earlier than non-migrants. Is it COVID or not? So we have to look at their health very carefully. And finally, very important point is that next 6 months, short-term migrants will suffer. Migrants are going to suffer. There will be no flights for them. They will have no money to pay. They will be stuck. Some of them even will die. I have seen already 150 Keralites are died in the Gulf. So everything will die. So short term, migrants are going to lose, but the long term, migrants will win. So migrant will be the winner in the long term. Short term, they lose. Migrants, I have seen the migrant as a winner because they are like warriors. They are like war heroes. They are not fighting with the country. They are fighting with poverty. They are fighting with unemployment. They are fighting in their own country to get out and make to achieve the sustainable development goals. They are warriors. They are war heroes. So I think they will win. Maybe now you look like they are going to be loser, but I'm sure migrants will say the final word. They will win, and their winning will start in 2021 January onwards. Thank you.
Right. Wow. Thank you very much, Professor Rajan. Warriors, that's what migrant workers are. And you're right, the Gulf will reopen in a massive way, but it's not just the Gulf. It's going to be across the world. And there's one sector that's going to be prominent, and that's going to be the health sector. A lot of healthline workers are going to be very, very important in this broader conversation that we will have. Right. That brings me to Dr. Gurung. Sir, you have the floor.
Yes. I have 3 points to make in very brief. Number one is, in destination and in back home, we are talking about informal migration and illegality. So there are a lot of discussion that illegal migrants should not be given the priority to bring back or for any kind of services. That should not happen. In fact, it is a humanitarian ground. Number two is, these migrants are economic heroes, but now after COVID, they are seen and they are considered as COVID carriers. So economic heroes are converted to a kind of victims or carrier of disease. So in back home in Nepal, if anyone coming from Gulf or anywhere abroad, migrants, they are chased and they are considered as a kind of a victim doing something wrong, So this is the situation. They should not be seen that way. Of course, they should be tested. COVID tested should be there, but not considered that way. The last thing is, how do we coordinate among ourselves in SAARC countries? Right, bringing back these migrants, or some kind of coordination in the destination country itself, in the camps, in the supplying the medicine or food. That should be considered, right? I am also, as you said clearly, that in last SAARC convention, it was declared, a point was declared that SAARC countries will coordinate and work together for migrant workers. And this is the right time that SAARC countries should work together for in destination and back home to bring them back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gurung. I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, 2014 was the last SAARC summit, and since then, in 2020, in the last 2 months, we've had 2 heads of state summit of SAARC, virtual heads of state summit, and where they've also initiated the SAARC COVID fund for emergencies, with all the SAARC countries contributing towards that fund. So I think it's very important that you raise the concept of SAARC coordination, even in the context of labor camps and in countries of destination. Right, that brings us to Dr. Shah. Dr. Shah, you have the floor.
Okay, very interesting discussions. So I really like your optimism, Rajan, about the fact that migrants are going to be winners in the long run. Okay, a couple of things that I would want to emphasize there. In order for migrants to be the winners, we have to keep a very careful eye on how the policies of the host countries change, how the kafala system reshapes itself, and how exploitive the kafala remains in terms of recruitment costs. So those are some of the parameters within which, and I mean, you were saying 20 to 30% irregular. Okay, so we can debate that. Okay, but it's large. I know that it's large. And so that's one part where we need to, again, have data, do studies, and it's very difficult, as you know. Okay, so to address the question of from unskilled to more skilled possibilities, if I understood the question, possibilities within the Gulf are relatively rare. So if you come in as a welder or a painter or that's where you stay for the 30 years that you are living there. So to move out of that is a very difficult one. But all countries are trying to upskill and so on. So, I mean, we could talk about that. So let me just stop with that.
No, my gosh, I mean, you saying that people will stay a painter or a welder or an electrician for the 30 years that they are there.
Or a taxi driver, yes.
Or a taxi driver. We have to really recognize that there is a skill conversation that we are not having as much. So thanks, Munir, as well for raising that question. I think it's an important question, and that mobility gap should be fixed. Bilesha, over to you.
Yes, Shabri. So you brought in about the informal sector and feminization, and also somewhere down a question I saw a concern about how labor migration affects young children. So I want to marry feminization, regulation, and informality in this wrap up little bit of mine. So starting with feminization, as you correctly said, Sri Lanka was very heavy on female migration. In 1997, 75% of all migrants from Sri Lanka were females. But we brought it down to 33% in like 2015-17, and this year it came up to 40%. So it's climbing up again. How did we bring it down? We introduced regulations. Specifically, there was this thing called the Family Background Report, where mother having a child less than 5 years would not be able to migrate for female domestic work. So that was the turning point in bringing down the female labor migration. So that was a piece of regulation. But when you bring in too much regulation, it paves the path for irregular or informal migration. So it had happened in Sri Lanka with the introduction of these FBR reports. Official statistics for female labor migration have come down, but there are other indications showing that still females do migrate for foreign employment outside the purview of the Sri Lanka Foreign Employment Bureau. So we should understand the nuances, the linkages, trying to protect the child. And then what has actually happened is the mother has gone outside the protection of the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment and might end up being more vulnerable. So in this post-COVID scenario future, when we start sending labor migrants in grand scale, and we should think of a paradigm shift in labor migration, recruitment and regulation, because recruitment has changed too. Earlier, it has to be an agent and there has to be a proper channel like that. But now with technology, platforms, and so many other ways, you don't need an agent anymore. In Sri Lanka, it shows clearly the statistics. Earlier, about 60% of labor migration went through an agent. But now, 60% go outside on their own contact. Why? Because there are many other ways to get a job. So recruitment methodology or techniques have changed. So then the regulation also have to change accordingly. You shouldn't be stuck in that stone age of regulating and then making people more vulnerable, making females more vulnerable. So that's it. Thank you.
Great, Bilesha. I mean, wow, you've just brought it all to me, so close to me, by talking about the mother and the child, and I'm glad you did. Today is my mother's birthday. It's always a good opportunity to raise how important it is for us to remember our mothers. So happy birthday to my mother. But on that note, I think there is a remark that I would like to make, and I quote here Professor Kamala Ganesh, who has said, "I think we ought to take note of the social upheavals that the return of international migrants will cause, even as internal migrants. And this is in India, this is in Bangladesh, this is in Sri Lanka, this is in Nepal, even as internal migrants with much less economic power also return to those same states and regions. Very important. Professor Ganesh, Kamala Ganesh, a very important point, and we see this as a huge issue. I think certainly something that we need to keep in mind. Okay, we have 2 more speakers, and then I have 3 guests. So let's get on with this. And I'm glad that even after 4 minutes overdue, we still have 132 participants. So let me hear now from Froilan. You have a minute, Froilan. Go ahead. You're on mute, Froilan.
Hello. Yeah, so high share of migrants in the Gulf also constitutes high risks, in public health. And a lot of Gulf countries are basically struggling to, maintain that image, abroad in terms of, providing all these humanitarian, benefits for a lot of migrant workers, while at the same time controlling the proportion of, migrants with, COVID cases. So for a lot of them, high proportion of these could really produce a lot of costs. So in the long run, as cases go up, a lot of these sending countries will likely sort of shift their, repatriation approach from a soft repatriation, which is currently amnesty, into a more hard and mandatory, repatriation approach in the long run. And that has a lot of, implications for sending countries. Because remember, a lot of these Gulf countries, they're struggling to maintain their sovereign wealth funds, aggravated by low price of oil and no tax revenues at the moment. So no investments and no confidence at all, from the international market. And they've created a lot of these mega infrastructures too. So, Gulf states are caught in this dilemma, similar to a lot of sending countries. So the challenge for them now is basically, how can we govern sort of mobility, right? This proportion of migrants, while at the same time maintaining their image, right? That they are actually doing something, that they're actually improving in the case of Qatar, in the case of UAE. Remember, you have these regional sort of events that are happening very soon. So it's a critical balance. It's a critical challenge for them. And I think it's very essential to look at these elements in the long run. So thank you so much.
No, thanks so much, Froilan. Andrew, as the last panelist, do you have not a 7 points, but 0.7 points? Go ahead.
I would love to just build on Froilan's comments. And I think it's important to recognize that the vast contingent of South Asia and migrants of all sorts in the Gulf states are actually key and essential features, not just of the Gulf economies, but to the political legitimacy of the authoritarian leadership in the Gulf states. These projects and these workers are the mechanism by which the families that control the state distribute that state-controlled wealth to its citizenry. Building these cities, constructing these cities, this is the economy of the Gulf states. And so I just wanted to ensure that not only are we talking about an economic dependency here, but we're actually talking about a socio-political dependency on which the authoritarian leadership's legitimacy rests.
No, bravo, thanks so much. Yeah, no, absolutely. Andrew, thanks. I appreciate you saying that. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Look, we have 3 final guest speakers in any which order, but if I may take the liberty, Ellen Sana from the Philippines, please go ahead, Ellen.
Thank you, Shabri, and thank you to all our panelists, and thank you for the opportunity. The Gulf is a very important destination of Filipino migrant workers as early as the 70s, as the Pakistans as well. And more than 60% annually goes to the Gulf. And I think but the issue is a lot of our migrants in the Gulf are into the services sector. A lot of them are low skilled. And of course, almost 60% of our women are in domestic work, including in the Gulf states. And that's why they are rendered quite vulnerable with this COVID pandemic. So, but then as Froilan is posing the question but then they are not going home. Because not all, like the domestic workers, they're not going to be terminated. But we can imagine that life would be quite challenging, and probably all these issues of overwork and other exploitation will be magnified in the times of COVID. But then those in the services, like in the UAE, that can be rendered non-essential, they are suffering right now. But then they know that life in the Philippines is more difficult. And so they and with this announcement of the UAE that they will be given this grace period for their visa until December, they changed their mind. They already registered with our consulates and embassies that they will be flying home. But then when they realized that they can stay until December, they again decided, no, okay, I will take my chance and stay until December. And then they will think about it if they will go home or not by December. But I think it's not the unwillingness to go home, but it's because, again, what prompted them to go there in the first place? It's really like a forced migration for many of them. And our government has recognized us from the time of Marcos, which started this mass migration to the Gulf. So it was because of the lack of decent job opportunities in the country. And so until now, and we are far worse off. We cannot, the economy is expected to be like between -1 and 0 or 1% growth. So what is that? So again, the whole point is they will plunge into the unknown, if only to have that little opportunity that maybe in the end they will find some jobs. So it's the job. It's not that they don't want to go home, but yeah.
No, thank you. Thanks so much, Ellen. Thanks. Thank you for bringing us back to the ground on this, the reality on this. Rula Hamathi from CCRM. So maybe also to complement some of the points that Andrew and Froilan made about the Gulf. Rula is based there, works extensively with the networks of civil society organizations in the Middle East itself. Rula, any word from your side?
Yeah, thanks, Shabli. No, I think it's been very, very interesting generally, but the conversation on irregularity, I think that was a very interesting conversation. And I think it's really important to, the idea of irregularity kind of providing protection or a shield in a way, it's really interesting to break down this idea, I would say. I mean, if we look at countries like Kuwait, for instance, you have on the one hand, these kinds of amnesty programs that are happening, but on the other hand, and internally, a lot of crackdown on irregular migration, a lot of crackdown on visa trading, and all of that, saying we need to reform that and change that. So I think the link here is to really recognize that obviously for irregular migrants to be in existence, there is a demand and there is a need for this kind of work. But the hook would be then to see what needs to happen in terms of changing the labor market, in terms of providing flexibility, in terms of providing mobility, to take out the migrants out of irregularity, but also to provide for this flexibility that we are asking for. I think Bahrain is a very interesting example in this regard. And I think the COVID situation would be kind of the test of these schemes, if they work or not.
Thanks so much, Rula. And I'm glad another good example that you gave in the context of Bahrain and what's happening there and what they're doing. Great. Final 1 minute word, and I think it's important to hear from a broader civil society perspective. William Goyes from Migrant Forum Asia. William? Not sure if William is there. William, we can't hear you. I noticed that your microphone is unmuted. Right now it's muted.
Hi, sorry, Shabri, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Sorry for the delay. Just to say, I think the question about drop in remittances is a very interesting one, but I think we have to take into account that it is more than just the drop in remittances. From the thousands that will be repatriated, there is a huge issue of wage theft, because there will be workers who will be repatriated who have not been given their dues, end of service benefits, and have been laid off and things like that, who will be coming back without getting the necessary compensation or dues that were supposed to be given to them. So I think you have to take that into the calculation as well, in terms of loss, in terms of economic loss. The other thing I think is important to look at, and that is what Pietro Mona has said, Ambassador Pietro Mona. I think we have to have a session of the SDGs to look at how much have we been set back, to, in terms of time and the goals and things like that, and maybe reassess some of the targets and the goals given the COVID.
No, great. No, thanks so much, William. And certainly, I think it's a good way to end. With regards to how can we go back to making sure that we live up to the commitments of the 2030 agenda, and given the fact that we only have another 10 years to go for living up to those commitments. Right, from my side, really, I have nothing further to add. Everything has been said here. All I do want to do is recognize a few important people, and those people are the people who have really been the people behind this show in organizing it and putting it together. Does everybody notice at the top left-hand corner, at least for me on my screen, is it says GRFDT New Delhi? And does everybody see Dr. Sadanand Sahu's frame there? And if you do, then please, I think a big round of applause goes to Sadanand Sahu and his team from GRFDT New Delhi, the Global Research Forum for Diaspora and Transnationalism, who really put this on. I mean, I cannot thank you enough, Sadaf. I cannot thank you enough, Sadaf, for bringing. Right, thanks, Sada. And could I be muted, please? I can hear myself. Could I be muted, please? I can hear myself. Sorry, mute. Yeah, thank you, Sada. And the other people in Sada's team are Rakesh, Alyona, Divya, Smita, Abhishek, and Feroz, who've all done such an excellent job and really even prepped me for this. But I know we have a vote of thanks, so I will step away now. Thank you so much. Appreciate this great job. Divya, over to you.
Thank you. Am I audible? All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Divya Balan, and I'm a member of GRFDT since 2012. It's my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the forum and our entire team. To begin with, I would like to extend our deep sense of appreciation for Mr. Shabri Nair. As a moderator, facilitating a panel discussion is no simple task, but you made it seem so effortless. And I could see several comments on your excellent style of moderating. Thank you so much, sir. We have a distinguished panel of discussants with us today. I would like to express GRFDT's sincere gratitude to all our speakers, Professor Irde Rajan, Dr. Ahsanullah, Dr. Ganesh Gurung, Professor Nashra Shah, Dr. Bilesha Veeraratne, Dr. Andrew Gardner, and Mr. Froilan Mallet Jr. Thank you for sharing your insights and the excellent coverage of issue areas actually, related to the Gulf migration in the current times of COVID and after. Listening to all of you was very, very insightful for us, especially since we are all working in the area of migration and diaspora. Thanks again to our esteemed speakers. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our heartfelt thanks to the most valued experts from across the world for attending and contributing to this panel discussion. Professor Vinod Khatriya, Ambassador Manju Seth, Ambassador Pietro Mona, Professor Brish Maharaj, Professor Kamala Ganesh, Professor Chandrasekhar Bhatt, Professor Pushpendra Kumar, Ms. Eleni Sana, if I pronounce it correctly, I'm not so sure, sorry for that, Ms. Rola Hamati, Mr. Ashley William, and many more. I think it's really impossible for me to read out all those names, so kindly excuse me for that. Thank you very much. Last but not the least, an online event of this extent could happen without enthusiastic participants. Today's turnout is 200 plus participants from more than 55 countries. We sincerely appreciate your time and effort in making this event a huge success. Actually, I still remember when 2012, when we started as a small group of 10 to 12 people in Delhi. And you know, in 2020, to see us in this massive extent, I would say, it's really sad, bad, cruel to say thanks to COVID, but I could say 300 plus people together from all over the world. I think this is time to celebrate, our success. GRFDT team, maybe we'll meet after this whole presentation, but we look forward for your participation in the forthcoming activities as well. Before concluding, I would also like to announce our next panel discussion. It is on livelihood issues of migrants during COVID-19 and future challenges. This is on coming Tuesday, 2nd June 2020 at 6:30 p.m. Hope to see you all there. Thank you very much once again to all the participants, to all the speakers, the moderator, esteemed distinguished guest speakers from all over the world. And I'm sure, like, there is there is no need to thank GRFDT team since we are organizing it. But then I think still it's part of the formality that I should thank all those who have worked really hard to make this this event a huge success. Even 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the night, all the WhatsApp messages and cross-checking whether this is done or that is done. I think it's something of this sort takes a lot of hard work, effort from all of us. And thank you so much. All of you stay safe. Thank you. Mr. Sada Sarov, over to you.
It's a marvelous session to Sada and a marvelous session.
I think deserves special applause. He is an excellent moderator.